Plain Truth, the show where we try to get into some of the mysteries and the anomalies and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Ziad Fadel, a lawyer in Michigan and someone quite familiar with the situation in Syria. Ziad, are you there?
I am there. Yes, I am here.
You're there. Okay, well, thanks for coming. We do appreciate it. And along for the ride is my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
I'm here. Welcome back, Ziad.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, Ziad, you were with us a year ago, and so I'd like to hear what's changed. But first, could you tell us a little bit about your background as a lawyer in Michigan, and then your website, and just a general intro?
I've been an attorney for 35 years in the state of Michigan, and I have a website which is read by about 1 million people. It's called www.syrianperspective.com, and it's almost a daily thing with me. I put up usually 1 or 2 posts a day, basically chronicling the Syrian army's victories over these terrorists, and I try to get as much detail as I can about them. Sometimes I have different kinds of entertainment pieces. Awards I give. Sometimes I'm meant to be satirical. I'm also a Supreme Court certified interpreter for Arabic and English here in Michigan, and I did my PhD at the University of Michigan. I did not complete my thesis because I went to law school instead, but it was at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I'm quite adept at speaking Arabic and pretty familiar with Arabic culture and the anthropology of the area.
The anthropology, well,
yeah.
It's one of the more, what shall we say, complicated areas of the world to study. How's that?
Indeed.
There's so much there. Well, thank you for the intro. I tell you what has happened in the last, year or so, would you say?
It is impossible in the span of 90 minutes, which is what we have to chronicle, again, the daily events that have taken place. What we know is this, is that the United States
picture,
now...
Mm-hmm.
Sorry?
The big picture, please.
Well, the big picture is this, that the United States now clearly is exposing its actual, secret policy with regards to Syria. There's no democracy here. There is no desire to help the majority Sunnis overthrow the government of Syria, because the majority Sunnis have already spoken in elections and in polls that have been taken by even the enemy. And it shows that President Assad is the favored person in Syria for the presidency. What the United States appears to be doing is sticking to a policy that is focusing on overthrowing the legitimate sitting government of Syria, led by President or Dr. Bashar al-Assad, which has a seat at the United Nations. And hopefully a lot of your readers know that the United Nations Charter is very clear about this, that no member state of the UN can attempt to overthrow the sitting government of another member state without violating international law and, of course, the United Nations Charter. In the case of the United States of America, the UN Charter was adopted by our Congress, and it's a law of the land. So the U.S. right now, openly and without any kind of hesitation, is making it very clear that we are interested in overthrowing the sitting government of Syria, and we are openly in violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. It's of some interest to me that some European diplomats recently said things. They're saying that with regards to attacking ISIS in Iraq, we will attack in Iraq because the Iraqi government asked us to, but we can't in Syria because the Syrian government has not. However, one diplomat said that what concerns us is that the United States doesn't seem to care as much as we do about international law. And you're seeing that right now with the United States attacking ISIS and the Nusra organization, both of which, by the way, were created by the United States, and without regard to whether or not the Syrian government has asked or permitted these attacks to take place.
Well, I thought the highest principle of international law as the U.S. sees it is that it's a unipolar world, and so the U.S. gets to say, how everything goes.
It's a cowboy mentality type thing, yes.
Well, I think it's the Wolfowitz doctrine that we can't allow any coalition to form that would be big enough to prevent us from doing what we want in the world. And so if, for example, Russia and China were to get together, that would have to be smashed because combined they would have the strength to stop U.S. control. So that's kind of the reality. I mean, international law is nice, but they believe in the guns. So
Yeah, well, it's also nihilistic because a coalition involving China and Russia in a war with us would mean the end of civilization as we know it. It's very nihilistic. Mr. Wolfowitz, besides being a neocon, is also a bit on the Daffy side.
the deathy side?
Daffy.
Oh, Daffy.
Daffy side. Yeah.
I was thinking of death, but yeah, I know. Well, so that's the big picture. Is that? But I tell you what is this ISIS? Where did that come from? Is this just a
ISIS
rebranding of al-Nusra?
Well, Nusra is a different organization. Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria. It is the Al-Qaeda franchise, which is approved of and authorized by Dr. The cave-dwelling Egyptian medical doctor, Ayman al-Zawahiri. And he has announced clearly that it is Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in this area of Iraq, Syria. ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Some people pronounce it ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which is wrong, by the way, but that's what the Obama regime likes to refer to it as. But the fact of the matter is, it is, in fact, an outgrowth of the Islamic State in Iraq, and originally led by one man who claimed to be the emir of the organization. It is, let me just put this point, it is ideologically and doctrinally exactly the same as Nusra, exactly the same, except for one thing, that it is not controlled by any single authority like Dr. Zawahiri, who lives in a cave in Afghanistan. It is, in fact, controlled by its own leader, who in this particular day and time happens to be Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, an Iraqi national, who was, by the way, a prisoner of the United States in Iraq during the American occupation there, and was released, amazingly. And my information is that he was then taken by CIA to Israel, where he underwent some kind of training. He received even a Rolex watch from a Mossad agent, which he still sports. This man is being, so much a man of the people, wears a Rolex watch given to him by a Mossad agent. He was apparently trained near Tel Aviv and supposedly was programmed. But his programming was not good enough, apparently, and now he's the target of so-called American attacks. The American attacks on ISIS so far, based on the evidence we're seeing from the Kurds themselves, have been relatively ineffective. And the Americans seem to be attacking mostly empty buildings and warehouses, whereas the Syrian army, which is never mentioned in American media, is actually doing the real fighting around the perimeter of that town in the north on the Turkish border. And while the Kurdish Peshmerga, not the Peshmerga to some extent, but the YPG and the PKK are doing the really heavy fighting.
Hey, Ziad.
But to answer your question, ISIS is an outcrop of Al-Qaeda. It took a different kind of road and now has become a caliphate, interesting enough.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on the Annan plan, which was essentially, I think it was drafted about 50 years ago by an Israeli academic who wanted to balkanize the Middle East into smaller states. Do you think that's
nothing new.
Do you think that's what's playing out or what's being played out here?
It's being, there's no question the United States wants, as part of its policy, to balkanize Syria. That's certainly to have a northern rump state where the capital would be Aleppo, and have a southern state where the capital would be Damascus, and that they are trying very hard in order to unseat the president of Syria to force him to create another rump state on the coast. This is all failing right now, but it is a part of the way they view the world. England wants something completely different. Mr. Cameron appears, from the evidence I have, to want a failed state. He wants to make Syria basically a failed political entity in which, like Libya, you have parties and tribes and factions all fighting one another, hopefully with the intent that they eventually send all their oil or whatever assets they have to the great United Kingdom. But that's basically what the British look at it as. The French, I think, just want to reassert their old hegemony in the area, in Syria, Lebanon. I don't see them as looking for a failed state, although that's exactly what they created in Libya. So, you try to figure it out. It sounds to me like what they're trying to do, very simply, and if you look at it at bottom, there is a plan to extend natural gas pipelines from Iran across to Iraq to Syria, and then, of course, to markets in Europe. The Russians have a very big interest in this because of their Gazprom monopoly, and they know that they're going to have control over this because of the relationship between Syria and the Russian Federation. Furthermore, you have a very large reservoir of natural gas that's been discovered between the island of Cyprus, Lebanon, and Syria. And of course, the Syrians are very excited about pumping that out of the ground too, and using it and marketing it in Europe. What at bottom what appears to be is that the neocons in Washington see this as a degradation of American power and influence. That when the Europeans start looking east for all their power needs and all their fuel needs, the U.S. will cease to be the great power that it is right now with all the great alliances. NATO falls apart. The U.S. itself becomes a second-rate country. This is a great fear in the United States, and we're trying to stop this by doing two things. One is creating a mess in Iraq to block the extension of the gas pipeline from Iran to Syria. Two, we're trying to destroy Syria to make it impossible for Iran to have influence with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and therefore to remove pressure from Israel. It seems like they're working hard to preserve this ghetto state, this apartheid state, and keep it nice and safe, and in the traditional way.
All right. So instead of looking at it as one or two agendas driving it, it's more like half a dozen, right?
It is hard to imagine any nations spending all this time, money, and effort for one agenda. I think there's a confluence of many, and they all are pointing towards trying to overthrow this one ophthalmologist, British-trained ophthalmologist in Damascus, who sits right in the middle of this maelstrom right now. And they are putting forth every effort they can, arming militias, sending in weapons for various routes, basically trying to destroy the country because they have to get rid of one man who represents the evil of a gas pipeline across from Iran to Syria and the evil of supporting Hezbollah.
One other thing I was going to ask you, do you think that ISIS really did go rogue, or do you think that they're actually still somewhat controlled by the West?
You brought up a very important point. Many of my friends whose opinions I respect think the way you're suggesting, that in fact ISIS is simply doing what the West wants it to. I happen to have the belief, based on my conversations with some Syrians, is that it appears that they have gone out of control. And this is why the U.S. feels somewhat comfortable in attacking it, while, interestingly enough, basically still getting support to Nusra, Al-Qaeda. The U.S. is actually in the same trench with Al-Qaeda. But, we'll see how this plays out. To what extent this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi will remain sort of the rogue element, and whether his movement will eventually just sort of start towing the line more or less with Western machinations.
It's quite a viper's nest, to put it mildly.
Oh yeah, I mean it is probably the most complex event in history. This attempt to overthrow Dr. Assad, as he said before, about 3 years ago in an interview, said that when you play around with Syria, you're talking about a country that's on the fault lines of everything. And you start messing around with it, and suddenly things just start going haywire. And that's exactly what's happening today.
Well, hey, Ziad, you've probably heard of Thierry Meyssan, the French...
Absolutely. I read him all the time, yeah.
Politician. He has a website called Voltaire.net.
I read it all the time.
Well, I don't know, a couple days ago or so, he wrote an article arguing that basically the anti-Syrian coalition has been divided over their goals, and this has made it very hard for them to achieve what they wanted. We can debate that. Obviously, Syria's been, to some extent destroyed, but nonetheless, it's still standing, and it hasn't been, partitioned and so on. And actually, if you read the article, I think it makes a reasonable case, and I think you can just get that feeling looking at the world's politicians that they actually don't have the same goals, and that this has complicated it for them. And then they've gone back and forth. It seems like there's a period when, they have more money coming from Qatar or Saudi Arabia, and then there's a period where they don't have as much money. I don't know. It just seems like they've had a confused war effort, and then probably also they've been getting various degrees of threats from Russia or Iran or Hezbollah, and that, I don't know, that might have made them hesitate a bit too. But why don't we look at that bigger? What do you think about Iran or Hezbollah or Russia in this equation?
Well, Russia
how
is
do
the
you
biggest.
see?
Well, Russia is the biggest player. I mean, this is a nation that has nuclear capabilities, and along with the United States, can turn this world into just a burned out ash. So sure, Russia is very important. We know that the defense minister of Russia about a year and a half ago met with Martin Dempsey, the chief of the American General Staff, the Joint Chief of Staff, and told him that an attack on Syria by the United States would be an attack on Moscow. We know that the Russians are serious about this. They do maintain a big fleet off the coast of Syria with a lot of ships that have cruise missile capabilities, and there are actual nuclear-powered submarines in the region. This is a warning to everybody that this is an area that we consider to be within our sphere of influence. With regards to Hezbollah, Hezbollah is a very powerful militia, and has played some role in some of the military successes in Syria, but really can't change the area's geopolitical structure. Hezbollah has 100,000 missiles. They're all aimed at Israel. But, I mean, could it stop the United States? The answer is it could contribute to it, but not stop the United States. Iran is very important. Iran has a massive seaborne missile defense capability. It is capable of knocking out our fleet in Bahrain. They made it very clear they can do that. In fact, their defense minister recently said he could do that in 50 seconds, supposedly, whatever that means. But the United States, I don't think, wants to get into a war with Iran, and certainly does not want to lock horns with the Russians. They're playing the game the way Obama likes to play everything. The Obama doctrine is you don't fight your wars unless you got proxies doing it for you. I believe him when he says he does not want boots on the ground. I believe him when he says that we're not, the number of troops we sent to Iraq are just for advisory purposes. I believe him when he says that because, in truth, historically, that's all he's ever done is provide logistics and some air support for our allies as they do the dirty work for the United States, as in Libya. So, and getting back to your point about they have different intentions, the British certainly want to have a failed state. The U.S. wants to have a Balkanized Syria where they have control over one part of it, enough to where they can block any kind of gas pipeline successfully, reaching the Mediterranean. And in essence, to create a situation where Hezbollah and Iran cannot function as successfully as they have over the last few years. So, yeah, I think you're right. They have different purposes. The Germans, for example, they have a real kind of schizophrenic personality today. On the one hand, you have Merkel always arguing for more sanctions against this or that. At the same time, their BND, their Bundesnachrichtendienst, their intelligence service is operating and cooperating with the Syrian intelligence service to identify individuals that Germans think might be a threat to European security. So you've got some really weird bipolar kind of, maybe unipolar is a better word, or no, multipolar world where you got people doing different things at cross purposes apparently, and nobody knows exactly how to make it all come together.
What do you see going on in Iran? Some argue that the new guy, Rouhani, has been really trying to make friends with the West. And we can notice that when Iran kind of came in from the cold a bit last November, it was like the day before things started to blow up in the Ukraine, which is interesting because it kind of implies that the Western power folks, are expecting to put the screws on Russia, and so they want to get more Iranian, oil or gas on the market.
Well, that hasn't worked, obviously.
No, obviously it hasn't worked.
Iran and Russia are very close. They cooperate very extensively on foreign policy.
Well, yes, I agree with you, but Rouhani, some argue, including Terry Mason, the guy we talked about a while ago, that Rouhani, really, if he could, would become closer to the West. It just hasn't quite worked out. What do you say to that?
The Iranians have a priority here. It's very important that they want to have the sanctions lifted. The question is, how do you get the sanctions lifted when the U.S. is asking the Iranians to essentially abandon their peaceful nuclear program? And that's where all the trouble starts. Sure, the Iranians would love to have access to American banking. They've had a hard time, transferring funds because they can't, get into the American system that apparently is the major conduit for this sort of thing. They'd like to have those sanctions lifted. Sure. And I think Rouhani is the kind of diplomatic personality. Everybody agrees that he is that way. Unlike Mr. Ahmadinejad, his predecessor, he's not as combative, and I think he's trying to do diplomatically what Ahmadinejad could not do by simply being, a bit on the hostile side. So yeah, I agree with you. He is definitely looking to improve relations with the West.
I'll toss out another idea that one of our guests, Joaquin Flores, had floated around, and it's essentially the doctrine that the British used to use to play the French and the Germans off against one another. So they'd support one state till the point where it got too strong, and then they'd flip the script and support the other state and just kind of play them off against one another endlessly, right? So I'm half wondering if that's what the United States game is here. Maybe the Saudi Arabians are getting a bit too strong, so it's time to start supporting the Iranians.
I don't know about to what extent that we would actually support the Iranians to have some balance with Saudi Arabia. Robert Ford, the former American ambassador to Damascus, an absolute war criminal, just said recently to a member of the exiled Syrian coalition that we will not allow any one side in Syria to win. That, like you're saying, we will strengthen you to the extent that you can put up a fight against Assad's army, but we won't let Assad either get so strong that he can sort of set you aside or scupper your plans or things like that. So it may be true that, in fact, the U.S. is applying that kind of philosophy, and it may not be so much with Iran and Saudi Arabia as it is in Syria with the exiled opposition, the so-called, I call it the fake Syrian army, and all the other groups fighting, never allowing any one group to get too powerful.
Hey,
so that might be the case.
Hey, Ziad and Jerry, I would add that if you look around the world the last 20 years, the U.S. the U.S. and its allies have created many, many failed states. Okay, there's Absolutely. Somalia, there's Libya, there's more. There's in Africa. They may be doing it in the Ukraine right now, and Afghanistan. I mean, they're probably more. I'm not even thinking about in Africa, and it's hard to believe this is all by accident. A failed state simply can't resist a determined opponent, whether that opponent is the American military or it's a big corporation, right? I mean, Somalia can't stop America from doing whatever it wants in the coast over there because it doesn't have a functioning government. And so, anyway, my point is, it's conceivable. I'm not saying it's the case, but it's conceivable that factions, like you were saying, Ziad, that Britain would like to see just a failed state, just endless fighting in Syria. No winners, just endless fighting. That sounds like a good deal to them. So that's certainly one scenario, Jerry.
Yeah, well, again, I'm also thinking of how they played Iraq off against Iran, and then when Iraq got too powerful, they tricked them into invading Kuwait and then used that as a pretext to weaken.
Well, yeah, if you buy Saddam's story about Ambassador April Glaspie's famous statement to him that, as far as we're concerned, anything in Kuwait is an internal matter for Iraq. Well, Glaspie denies ever saying that. And there's a debate on whether or not Saddam actually heard that the way he wanted to. But it's interesting how, and I will respond, to that point. When Saddam did invade Kuwait, there was an interesting sort of media effort to somehow justify American response and the military response to that. If you remember, the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter appears before Congress to describe how Iraqi soldiers went into hospitals in Kuwait and threw out babies from the incubators. Do you remember that?
I remember it well.
Well, okay, you remember it well. I mean, it could be said that the CIA would know for sure who this gal was, and that she certainly was not in Kuwait. She hadn't been in Kuwait for the last 3 years before that time, and she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. Yet it was never revealed until way later when some journalists investigated the matter. It turned out the whole thing was a canard. Now, the U.S. was relying on that as though they wanted the American public to support an American response militarily to Saddam Hussein. Even though I remember Mr. Bush getting up on the TV all the time and using his read my lips type of logic, going, Saddam must withdraw from Kuwait. He knows he must destroy it. And it was as though he was telling him that, you have a chance to get out, which was puzzling to me, because if Saddam had any brains, he would have pulled out, as General Assad was telling him from Damascus. But he didn't. It's like the U.S. knew how he thought, and that he would not actually ever withdraw until he was forced to leave. And then what did we gain by doing it? We never went to Iraq. We kept them in power. You go figure.
Well, they did weaken the military quite a bit, though. I mean, and slapped sanctions on them.
Yeah, they did. I mean, it wasn't that strong. It was a paper tiger to begin with. I mean, Saddam had been operating, basically without access to the major weapons markets. He thought he had a big army, but in truth, his huge army was nothing more than a bunch of sectarian elements. We knew that by the way we fought him, and it was obvious that he had no power whatsoever. His army collapsed and crumbled.
No, go ahead, Ziad.
No, go ahead. No,
I was just going to say, well, this kind of segues into some of the false flags and phony pretexts that they're kind of floating around in Syria. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about some of those.
Well, there's a chemical weapons fiasco where the United States once again insists that the Assad government use chemical weapons on its own people. Well, the evidence is overwhelming now, and it's obvious from all the reports coming in, whether it's from MIT here in the United States or from British sources, by the way, that it could not have been the Assad government which used the chemical weapons, and now it's pointing more and more towards Bandar bin Sultan, the former general security head of the Saudi Arabian government, and it was in fact and I remember George Galloway, he's a member of Parliament in London. I think you guys know him. Very outspoken, very eloquent man with a thick Scottish burr, and he was telling members of the House of Commons, he goes, it would be a new definition of stupidity for Assad to use chemical weapons on his people the same day the UN investigative team was arriving in Damascus. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it points more towards a plan by the Saudi Arabians, who are not very skilled, by the way, in anything, a plan to basically embarrass the Syrian government and sort of bring in the issue or highlight the issue of chemical weapons being used by the government, out of as an act of frustration. That's one of the false flags. Other false flags were in Aleppo, where people who lived there and saw the use of chemical weapons pointed straight at the opposition and said this was not from the Syrian army, it was from the terrorists themselves who were at Khan al-Assal, for example. It's one big area. The evidence against the Assad government when it comes to chemical weapons is so flimsy that the U.S. has not really pushed it very hard, because they know that in a proper tribunal and an actual forum, it would be shown to be completely incompetent as evidence. So it's just been basically false flags, trying to rile up Americans. Americans are very easily get their feathers ruffled when they hear about innocent people being killed, and in the hope that they get some support. And it hasn't not materialized yet, though.
And we've also get the usual media fakery and false images and false
beheadings
stories.
and remember what's his name, Danny the Syrian, who was filming attacks by the Assad government on innocent civilians in Homs, Syria. He wasn't even in Homs. He was filming that in England. And the women around him who were wearing the kerchiefs on their heads were in fact Albanian refugees. And
yeah.
he was he's exposed on Anderson Cooper's program. Anderson Cooper was very embarrassed by the expose. Asked Danny the Syrian, says, Danny, how do you think they got that tape showing you giving directions to your production team about how to handle the sound effects? And he says, well, with a very nice, nice British accent indicating some measure of, status, I think basically good economic status, and said he didn't have any idea how they got a hold of it. If you can believe that incredible silliness.
Yeah, I think the latest one, there's some video that went viral about a boy saving some young girl, and that turned out to be completely staged as well. So the whole war seemed, the whole atrocities thing seems, highly holographic.
Well, false flags are as old as the hills. Remember, Ziad, maybe you've heard the quote, you provide the pictures and I'll provide the war, right? From the Spanish-American War, I guess it was?
I remember seeing the movie Wag the Dog, and I'm fully aware of the fact that the U.S. has the technical ability to create any kind of scenario, and as long as there's a barrier between the viewer and the machine that presents it, they can do it, and they can successfully do it, for sure.
So, Ziad, all of these false flags and whatever, do you think they've backfired against the West, or how is that played out?
Well, if you think about Thierry Meyssan and people like yourselves, Dr. Stagenborg, a lot of people who are involved in the alternative media, Americans are listening to that, and they're getting a picture like that's sort of that disputes what the U.S. government is saying about events in Syria. And we're not talking here about Obamacare or talking about the local dog catcher. We're talking about America going back to war at a time when the American people are tired of it. And so the U.S. government is trying to create images and trying to create sort of a trigger points for the American public, which they hope will result in support for American policy, which is more aggressive, more muscular, etc. But it's not working, is it? In poll after poll, Americans are showing a lack of interest in the kind of muscular foreign policy that John McCain, this wacko out of Arizona, is calling for. So the false flags are coming, fast and loose. They're out of control practically. There are stories being published in the mainstream media which are totally false. You have a little boy saving a little girl, all rigged by some studio. You're having Danny the Syrian in Homs being bombarded by the Syrian army when he wasn't even in Homs, and all kinds of stories of the like, this type, and it's just simply not working.
I've got a question for you, Ziad. How much do you think, say, the Saudis are acting on their own versus taking orders from Washington or Tel Aviv?
It's interesting. It's a good question. The Saudis have a problem with Obama's foreign policy. They want him to be more aggressive. They tried to get the United States to bombard Syria a year ago, and had it not been for the Russian intervention, basically setting up a deal whereby Syria would give up its CW weapons, there may have in fact been another one of these horrible American mistakes creating a disastrous result in Syria. But as it turned out, Mr. Obama, whose philosophy is basically not to get involved, walked away from it and created a problem with the Saudis. They really were aggrieved by what he did. They desperately want to have Assad out of power for a number of reasons, and some of it's religious. But yes, the Saudis and the Americans right now appear to have a different view of things. At the same time, the Saudis cannot survive without American support. That's the one thing we have over them. They cannot survive as a monarchy, as a pre-Iron Age monarchy in that country, because without the United States, I'll tell you, if we walk out on them, it'll be a matter of 6 months to a year before a revolt will take place, and they will be overthrown. And they know that.
Hey, Ziad, I didn't know they had iron there.
Damascus steel.
Okay, post-Iron Age. Yeah.
Well, I think it's pre-Iron Age, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, give them the benefit of the doubt on that one. But that is a good question because there are these players, like Qatar was deeply involved, right? And again, are they independent actors or are they not? I mean, they have all of their money in Western banks, right? I mean, the West can shut them down in a second, and that's it. They're all essentially bankrupt.
Well, they can shut those banks down, too, by withdrawing their money if they can. The other thing, too, don't forget that Qatar is the biggest military base for the United States in the area. So, I mean, we've got troops there to protect that miserable regime, and they're no different than the Saudi Arabians. They're Wahhabis. They are backward. They are just reactionary as hell, and we're there to protect them. The moment Qatar plays the game a little too independently, the U.S. could always withdraw its support and just leave them to the lions or the wolves.
Okay, got a question for you. So we can see the Saudis and, anyway, the enemies of Syria, okay, Turkey, Jordan, the Saudis, and the Qataris. What have...
And NATO, yeah.
Well, yeah, of course, but let's just stick to these countries. What have the Syrians, Hezbollah, Iran, or Russia done to essentially fight these guys?
Well, the Syrian army...
Do you know what I'm trying to say,
army.
in other words? Right, but what I'm saying is not just inside Syria. Inside Syria, they're sending all these, mercenary gangs, right? And then you're blowing them up. Is there anything that the Syrian alliance can do to harm them?
Well, I don't think that Russia has the ability to do more than shut off the natural gas to Europe, which will crush the Europeans. And Putin is a pretty practical kind of guy. He doesn't appear to want to do that. and he won't do that unless things get very hot in Ukraine or the Europeans get a little bit too aggressive with him. The Iranians themselves are dealing mostly now with the East. They have a good relation with the Indians, but they don't seem to have a lot of influence as far as Qatar is concerned, short of maybe bombing them down the road. That's not going to happen. The Iranians basically are there to make sure that the U.S. understands that they have the ability to harm American military interests. They have the ability to start a large uprising against the Saudi government on the eastern part of Arabia, which is largely Shiite. That's about it. I mean, economically speaking, Iran is suffering because of the sanctions, so there's no real economic clout there. The Russians appear to be interested in continuing profitable relations with Europe, as long as the Europeans don't get too goofy on them.
Well, what about
I would
Turkey
say that right now they're doing not much.
What about Turkey and Jordan? I mean, for example, there
Turkey
are
receives
pipelines,
almost,
there are other things. Mm-hmm.
You know, the Turks receive their natural gas from Iran and from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
My information is that they so far they pay their bills, and the Russians are interested in keeping that relationship. But the Turks are also aware. This is the Erdogani Turks, not all the Turks, but the Erdogani Turks are aware that Russia is very unhappy with the policies of Ankara. And you know about the famous conversation between Putin and Erdogan a week ago, when Erdogan calls Putin in Moscow and says, "We're willing to work with you towards overthrowing Assad, and we'll have some, there was some kind of emolument or some kind of enticement that he mentioned." Putin told him that he would not do anything of the kind, and that in fact Erdogan was contributing to the mass murder in Syria. And there was a veiled warning. Erdogan responds to him saying that, are you threatening Turkey? And Putin says, you can take it any way you like. This is according to sources inside Turkey. So we know that the Turks have not given up on this idea of overthrowing Assad for reasons that are puzzling, frankly. But we know that the Saudi Arabians have promised a lot of money to the Turks if they can engineer the ouster of our president. So see how that works out.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just about to bring that up as well, the call from Putin to Erdogan.
Yeah.
And is that legitimate? Or, I mean, that was printed in, I think, the Moscow Times, which is actually, ironically, an anti-Russian newspaper. Do you think it really happened, or do you think it's just hearsay, I guess?
Well, I know that Putin told Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, about almost 3 years ago, when Kirill went to him and said, "You have to help to protect the Christians of Syria," and Putin responded in front of people that, "I would rather have these terrorists running in the streets of Moscow than in Damascus." So we know that Putin so far, based on his actions, the consistency with which the Russian military establishment has supported the Syrian army, we know that he is sincere, that he is committed to it, and that he views Syria as part and parcel of a larger agenda for the future for Russia, its ability to project power into the warm waters of the Mediterranean, for example. Without Syria, that cannot happen. He is absolutely committed to it. And I can tell you that based on my knowledge, because I know people in the Syrian military, that whenever the Syrian army has needed weapons, ordnance, diesel fuel, the Russians have always been there to make sure that these particular items have been provided. And you can see the result in that.
It's like you're reading my mind, because that was the next point I was going to raise, was that a lot of people say, what is Russia doing? They just kind of threw Syria to the wind. They're not doing anything. But I would argue, people made the same argument about the Ukraine, right? And, he definitely was supporting them, but just not in a visible way, which is probably a smart way to do it.
The Russians have been very legalistic, if you notice, over the last few years. When you look at Sergei Lavrov's policies and how he expresses Russian policy, it's always in a very legalistic way, following international law. This is actually more consistent with the European way of looking at the world than it is the American way. It's always been like taking matters to forums in the United Nations, resolving issues through dialogue. For example, the Russians, who know better than we do that the Syrian foreign exile opposition is worthless, they know it very well, keep insisting on having a diplomatic political solution to the problem in Syria. And yet they persist in always keeping doors open to the opposition to come and negotiate a settlement with the Syrian government, even though we all know that they have no control over the militias and the terrorists and these rats who are running all over the country. So the Russians are very legalistic. They're following a traditional policy of diplomacy over might, and they're making the U.S. look pretty bad because we're the ones here in the United States who are looking like we're rolling up our sleeves, getting ready to get into an Irish fist fight, whereas the Russians seem like they're smooth and they're very open to creative diplomatic ideas. True, but the Russians also have unloaded billions of tons of weapons in Syria, and a lot of it not paid for.
What about, I think, was it S-300s or S-400s? I can't remember.
The S-300s are already in Syria. We know, I've seen them with my own eyes. So people can tell me that the Russian President Putin has now authorized the delivery of S-300s. And 2-3 weeks ago, the foreign minister of Syria, Mr. Walid Muallim, was on TV and announced that the Russians had agreed to send S-300s to Syria. These are very, very advanced anti-aircraft missile systems. The Syrians already had these, and the president of Syria said this 2 years ago. He said in an interview, we already have them. What I think is happening here is a veiled threat. With the U.S. now bombing northern Syria, in the Aleppo area and the area of Deir ez-Zor and wherever ISIS is found, Mr. Muallim was telling the United States that, look, you're doing this without our permission, and maybe you are attacking our enemies. I think it probably is a good thing, but at some point you have to realize that we have the ability to hit back at you if you ever choose to strike the Syrian army.
All right.
I've seen the S-300s with my own eyes on the coast of Syria.
So in terms of political realities on the ground, like, have there been any reports that the United States have actually hit Assad's forces or anything like that, or has it strictly been?
To this day, it has not happened.
Okay.
But one American, I believe it was Martin Dempsey, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that if Assad attacks the moderate rebels, you know what the U.S. calls moderate rebels, these are usually the beheaders and the rest of the riffraff. But if he hits, in other words, people we support, we will attack the Syrian army. And I think this response from Mr. Muallim is directly related to that statement by Mr. Dempsey, General Dempsey. If you're going to attack our forces, we will hit back at you. And now the Russians make a statement in support of that by saying we're going to send S-300s. It may be they're sending S-400s for all we know. But the Syrians want to announce the fact that they have the ability to knock out American jets.
And Turkey, I mean, they've been caught with their pants down a couple times too. I think they had been caught with some type of conversation where they're planning to pull a false flag on a tomb or something.
Yes. They're just open. There's the tomb of Othman's grandfather, Suleiman, is in northern Syria near Aleppo. It's a piece of land that was given to the Turks by the French, the same miserable French who gave them a large chunk of Syria. It's called Hatay, H-A-T-A-Y, on the coast. A totally Syrian Arabic area, but nonetheless, that's a different matter. Yes, I remember reading the dialogue, and I remember Erdogan becoming very incensed at how anybody could reveal this information because it damages national security. Clearly, he did not deny that this actually took place. The conversation was with Hakan Fidan, the head of their MIT, that's their CIA in Turkey, along with Davut Oglu, who was at the time their foreign minister, now their prime minister, and of course with Erdogan there, and also a military, I believe was General Necdet Özel was also there. I'm not sure which military man. Yes, it happened.
And they've also been deliberately trying to provoke Assad and the Syrians as well. I think they shot down a plane or two, and they've.
Well, they claim that it was in Turkish, airspace. The Syrians say it was not, and that's happened over Keseb in the northern part near the coast, and the pilot was able to eject safely, though, luckily.
All right.
Well, I got a question for you, Ziad. Have there been any peace offers made by the West that were, I guess what you would say is serious? legitimate. No. In other words, not just tactical.
No, they all call for the establishment of transitional government, and they all are conditioned upon no future in Syria's life or politics with President Assad there. That's a non-starter. It's ridiculous and will not be accepted.
I mean, they
but
have
transitional government with the president is fine.
Well, okay, but I mean, well, anyway, I'll take your answer at that. But I'm just saying they might, say he can stay for 2 years, and then after that they have a new election or something like that. There's nothing like that.
The Syrian government made it very clear there won't be anything like that, and the U.S. can try to finagle some kind of ouster or some kind of transition, but the Syrian government is unwilling to allow foreigners to dictate to it how Syria's future should be designed. If it's going to be Syrians talking to Syrians, that's fine. The legitimate Syrian opposition inside Syria, that's fine. If we're talking about war criminals in Europe who are former felons in Syria, that's not okay. And I don't think that's going to work.
Then the follow-up question, have there been any peace offers that are more, I guess you'd say, friendly, like from Iran or, like you said, the internal opposition? In other words, they're not really just tricks to try to destroy the country.
Well, that actually took place. The Syrian government, first of all, amended the constitution, and the constitution provided for elections, which had to be conducted at least between 60 to 90 days before the end of the sitting president's term. We had that in July. The Syrian people spoke. They voted for this president. He's now in office, and there's a cabinet and there's a parliament. The Syrian opposition inside Syria today, that is the legitimate opposition, has not been asking for any kind of change at all. So as far as we're concerned, for another 7 years, about 6.5 years now, we were going to have President Assad in office, and these people should be planning a new campaign to maybe win the presidency from him. That's how we do it in the United States. That's how it's going to be done in Syria. But for the U.S. to try to engineer some kind of change of government, that's not acceptable at all.
How about the amnesty program? I think Dr. Ziad had offered amnesty to any of the rebels that wanted to, lay down arms. And
it is working wonderfully in Syria. We have had tens of thousands of former fighters, former people who had maintained safe houses for these criminals, these terrorists. We've had people who are gun runners turn themselves in and sign a contract with the government not to take up arms against the Syrian people, the Syrian government, or the Syrian state. It has worked wonderfully. There have been some exceptions. Those people who sign an agreement and then are caught, basically, not following through, can expect the worst.
Yeah.
But so far, it's been extremely successful. Many people going back to their normal lives. Many, in fact, Syrian officers who defected have been accepted back to the Syrian army, or if not in the Syrian army, then the National Defense Forces. So you're getting kind of a burgeoning defensive force now in Syria, made up some of it made up of former rebels, former defectors, and former terrorists.
I think a lot of the Syrian rebels have sort of had a rude awakening and probably realized that they kind of got played like fiddles, right?
Exactly right. Some of them have realized that this war to overthrow the president of Syria has resulted in bringing in all these crazies, Al-Qaeda types, Wahhabists who are beheading people. There are many of these defectors who found out that their own towns, their hometowns, were victimized by these criminals, and so naturally they now regret having ever left the military or having ever taken up arms against the Syrian people, and you're seeing that more and more today.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about there was a story that got quite a bit of play in the West about the Yazidis and how and they're being allegedly massacred and whatnot. How true is that?
Well, the evidence we have, and I'm not there, and I'm not in northern Iraq, but the evidence is overwhelming that there was in fact an effort by ISIS to kill off a large number of Yazidi or Izidi men. Many of the girls, apparently, these are now the very exaggerated media here in the West, claiming that ISIS was selling the virgin girls off for a larger price or giving them away as gifts to those ISIS killers who killed the most. things of that kind, horrific stuff that would really get most Americans very upset and maybe more in a mood to intervene to save the Yazidis. Whether or not Americans have ever heard of the Yazidis before or not is really irrelevant. I think Americans would not view that as something to work against, helping them. But I still think that overall, despite Obama's efforts and the CIA's efforts to create a mood in this country, one is more militant, has failed miserably. The Americans still don't want any more Afghanistans, Iraqs, or Vietnams. I believe that strongly.
Except maybe the Christian Zionists, which is probably the most ironic of all, because they're essentially the people in the West that are cheerleading these wars, and the irony is that these wars have caused more Christian deaths than anything, right?
Well, yeah, as long as they bring on the end of time and the return of Jesus Christ on a burning chariot, and there's going to be the
rapture.
The rapture, we're all sucked up into judgment, whereas most of us will go to hell. But the few good ones, like the Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, will wind up in heaven. These people belong in some kind of different dimension of existence. I listen to them talk all the time. I actually watch John Hagee. I laugh whenever I'm depressed. I need something to cheer me up. I like to see the Three Stooges, or I watch John Hagee.
What about John McCain? No, John.
Well, McCain is. Isn't it amazing that people of Arizona, are they that old? Are there so many blue hairs in Arizona that they can't understand this man is not competent mentally to hold this office? He was called a traitor right on television by a former, I believe a colonel in the U.S. military, because he felt that McCain should not be supporting Al Qaeda or going and meeting openly with these killers in northern Syria. The man is sick, and he's not the first American senator to be kind of on the questionable side. But certainly he's a.
I don't know. I think there's something refreshing about him because he's honest. No, he's honest. No, he's honestly crazy, and he honestly wants as many wars as possible.
Okay.
And a lot of them are psychopathic and crazy and whatever, but they're good at hiding it, and so they don't have a position that you can actually nail down. Not all of them.
They don't do many photo ops with terrorists.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Here's a guy who does photo ops with, radical Nazis, with, beheading Wahhabis and stuff like that, and says this is what, these are American values, right?
Yeah.
Right? And I mean,
well, these are heroes. Yeah, that's right.
Right, these are heroes. And he says it. He does it, and there are the pictures, and he asked them to come visit him in Washington. And I think that's refreshing compared to all these devious, cunning types like Clinton.
I think what's happening here is you're becoming jaded. The American political system can get you to that point where you just simply become hardened to ordinary logic. The man obviously is honest, and he's honest, I think, because he's got something along the lines of the dementia.
A disease.
He's not sharp enough to hide things anymore.
He can't hide his lying. Yes. Well, I know, but Ziad, I'm originally from D.C., and so I guess it's just that your definition of honesty changes the closer you get to Wall Street or D.C., right?
Yeah,
Honesty is not deceiving the victims. But anyway, enough of that. I got a kind of a higher level question for you. This it might not be that
higher
easy.
level than John McCain. Oh my God.
Well, he's in the gutter. Okay, here's the question: what do you think it would take to get peace? To get the West and all of these factions to accept, to give up? What do you think it would take? What is it really going to take, like economic collapse or Russia and China threatening the West? What? Because look, the Saudis and the Qataris and all these others, they can hire desperately poor guys, give them rifles as cannon fodder, right?
Right.
For as long as we can imagine. They can probably do that for 20 years. And so to actually kind of get peace, what do you think is required?
Wow, as complicated as the problem is, the gas pipeline is so crucial that I think we'd have to find a way to handle that issue. How do we get a gas pipeline from Iran through Iraq to Syria? And all these countries have agreed to this. And have it in such a way that the Europeans would not be reliant on it, that the U.S. would not lose influence in Europe because of a European reliance on the fuel assets of, say, Iran and Russia and so forth? I don't know the answer to that question. I know that there's an effort to shake things up to prevent that from happening. So how do we convince Merkel, convince Hollande in France, and Cameron in England, and Obama in Washington, that there is a way around this problem of?
And I noticed that you didn't say anything about convincing Netanyahu to give up.
Well, Netanyahu, I think his ability to handle this kind of problem is going to be dependent on the moods in Europe and the United States.
Oh, okay.
He's not big enough to handle it himself. But as long as the French, for example, are working with the Saudis and the Turks to overthrow Assad, he looks at it as a green light for him to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. But all I can tell you is that the only way to have peace, I think, is when the Syrian opposition, be it in Europe, an exile opposition, or the one inside Syria, or the ones who are working within the so-called Free Syrian Army, decide that they no longer want to have foreign influence in their country and begin working towards, building a bridge to the government in Syria. And in 7 years they can have their own elections, and maybe they'll beat Assad. If they can't beat Assad, well, that's an indication he's popular. But at least that way we can be assured that the Syrians making decisions for Syria and not foreigners coming from Chechnya or from Uzbekistan or these idiotic countries coming to fight in a country like Syria in a jihad. I can't think of anything else, because the U.S. is not going to stop.
Well, that's my concern. Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, from an Islamic perspective, I know you're actually Christian and whatnot, but from an Islamic perspective, how do you think Islamic eschatology plays into what's going on in Syria? Because if I'm not mistaken, isn't the Mahdi or something supposed to arrive after Damascus is set to rubble?
That's a Shiite doctrine that's very important to the Shia. At the present time, I have not heard anything from the Wahhabist school, which is a Hanbali type school, and if you want to refer the jurisprudence that buttresses this, or from the Sunnis, indicating any desire to have the end of the world take place and Christ and the messenger of God, Muhammad, coming back, and then the world will end and all. I don't think I've heard that from the Sunni side. So the eschatology, the teleology of it, it's something that is not impacting too much. What is interesting, though, is looking at how Saudi Arabia has established throughout the world a network of mosques which it funds, and how whenever it needs clergymen to rise up at the pulpit and to exhort young Muslims to go and fight in the jihad, how easy it has been for the Saudis to do that. We've seen it here in the United States. We know they have it in England. But the moment the Saudis who fund these mosques say, we need you to tell these young men, many of whom are unemployed or maybe frustrated, to get up and come and fight in the jihad in Syria. The Saudis went so far as to release men on death row in Saudi Arabia. You may have heard about this, but the proof is overwhelming, because the letter from the Department of the Interior, or the Ministry of the Interior in Saudi Arabia, was intercepted, and they have the names of all the criminals on death row to be beheaded being offered a chance to go to Syria and to avoid execution, but to join in the jihad as long as their families remain in Saudi Arabia. So imagine how intense the effort must be, but how devious and how deeply rooted the Islamic character of this war is when it comes to the Wahhabists in Arabia, and how much money they spent to try to create this network that is absolutely amazing, frankly.
Well, the Saudis are very pious people, except when they're demolishing the birthplace of the Prophet to put up a new palace for the House of Saud.
Oh, they are so. In fact, when a book came out by Kamal Saliba, a very famous professor of Semitics in the Middle East, and he said that the Bible, actually, the Old Testament, came from Arabia. And he proved it through a study that you call. Hang on, let me think of the word that he used. Anyway, it has to do with place names. And toponymic. It was a toponymic analysis showing that, in fact, all of the place names in the Old Testament were actually in Arabia on the western coast, near north of Yemen. Well, imagine when that book came out, what happened. The Saudis were observed sending in bulldozers, literally wiping out every trace of any town that he mentioned in that book. Just to show you how religious they are and how decent and open-minded they are. And of course, 2 years ago, they executed a woman, they beheaded her for sorcery. So much for religion.
Have they? I believe it was in Saudi Arabia. Or maybe it might have even been one of the terror cells in Syria. But didn't they recently execute a very popular Shia cleric?
Well, the Saudi Arabians have condemned Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who is a very popular Shiite cleric, to death. And Iran has warned the Saudi Arabians about this and warned them told them not to do it because it's going to create a lot of bad feelings. In fact, my prediction is that if they do execute Sheikh Nimr, that there is going to be a revolt in Arabia on the eastern coast.
What's the demographics of the Shia Sunnis in Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia is overwhelmingly Sunni, but there's a very large and important minority of Shia on the east coast in the areas which are the richest in oil, and the Shia work a lot in the oil fields. They've been pretty quiescent for most of their lives, and they basically ask for respect from the government and not to be treated as though they were apostates. The problem is the Saudis allow anti-Shia propaganda to be taught in their schools. And there's kind of a hatred towards Shia. They feel it. They detect it, and they've been asking to have these kinds of schools or these books and materials used by Saudi students, thrown away and replaced with something that's more, peaceful, more understanding, more open-minded.
Well,
but
Ziad,
the Shia are a very important minority.
I think now we're getting into a second issue here, and this is important. So a minute ago we talked about if there was nothing that Iran or Russia or Syria or Hezbollah could do to harm the people behind this war. But actually you could make the case that you could do something, and that some make the case that Saudi Arabia is kind of paranoid because they think their whole system might collapse.
I discussed that with you earlier. I said, yeah, Saudi Arabia, in fact, it's a very fragile system they have there. Yes, you're right.
And so Russia or Iran or, I don't know, whoever, Syria, Hezbollah, could possibly fund groups or, I don't know, whatever, but create all kinds of problems for Saudi Arabia, blow things up, I don't know, whatever. But it might not be that hard to do. And so it kind of raises the question why they haven't done it.
Let's take the example of Bahrain. Bahrain is overwhelmingly a Shiite country. It's an island in the Gulf, oil rich, mostly Shia who are oppressed by a minority of Sunnis. Iran has the ability to arm the Shia on that island, or at least could issue exhortations to violence through their radio and television communication systems. But Iran has not done that yet. And one of the things I think that troubles Iran is that they view themselves as pan-Islamic themselves. They are pan-Islamic. They don't view Sunnis as their natural enemies, and that they try harder, I think, to bring them in or to at least get Sunnis to accept them as true Muslims, unlike the Saudis who are very rejectionist and are very close-minded. Iran, it may be that the Iranians to this day, you take, Ayatollah Khamenei, are not interested in being viewed as creating problems within the Islamic world, but instead want to be viewed as solving problems. So it may be the way they want to be perceived. But you are absolutely correct. The Iranians have the ability to change the demographics of Bahrain in probably a month. And Saudi Arabia could be a real problem for security reasons because of that kind of connection between Shiite Iran and Shiite Eastern Arabia. True. Why they don't do it? I think I've answered the question.
Well, that answers the question regarding Bahrain and for Iran. But as an example, it doesn't, why wouldn't Russia, for example? I mean, I understand Russia has an alliance with China, and China has a lot of money in Saudi Arabia. right? And so Russia doesn't want to anger China. But I'm just saying the survival of Syria is so important that if you just endlessly allow Turkey, France, all of these countries to attack Syria, I mean, if this continues for another 10 years, I mean, geez.
I've been told this by a lot of people, not just you. I mean, it's a fact, Paul, that a lot of my friends say, well, what if this just goes on and on? I mean, at some point, and maybe this is the strategy that the U.S. is now implementing in the area, at some point the Syrian people will rise up against Assad if he's viewed to be the problem, and there's a hope that maybe they'll overthrow him. So far, that has not happened, and it looks like it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. But maybe when Robert Ford told that one member of the opposition that we're not going to allow anybody to win, but instead allow them to constantly fight each other, that maybe down at rock bottom, that is the American perception of the future of the country, that the Syrian people will get so tired of war, they'll rise up against Assad. But you are absolutely correct. It's very frustrating, yes.
Well, I mean, even with that quote about Putin telling Erdogan, back off, I mean, in what sense? They can still just endlessly send terror gangs in, right? Right? They just don't send in the Turkish military.
Exactly right. That's exactly what they're doing.
But that's what they've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years.
ISIS is based in Turkey. Your readers and your listeners should know that ISIS is actually based in Turkey.
Yeah,
I've seen some pictures of them of the ISIS fighters, at the border with the Turkish military forces. Yeah, having tea.
Confabulating, yeah, sure. In fact, they had a meeting a month ago in Istanbul, approximately a month ago, where the ISIS attendees were discussing how to bring their revolution to Turkey. Now, obviously, they did not please the Turkish authorities too much, but they're actually allowed to meet. This is Al Qaeda, cubed, meeting in Istanbul under the eyes of the Western media and the Eastern media, and they're having total access to facilities and assistance in Turkey, besides just being sort of waved through at the various border or checkpoints. Erdogan is deep up to his neck in blood, and it's a matter of time, I think, before justice catches up with this miscreant.
Well, and again, I don't know how much control the West has over ISIS at this point, but if Erdogan sort of got out of hand, I guess the West could maybe try to threaten destabilization of his regime with some of their agents too, right?
Yeah, but he's in the same trench. The problem is the French and the Turks are working together along with the Saudis. You may be right that they have different purposes in mind, but they all come together at one point, is that they're all anti-Assad, and they come together at that particular way of thinking. So maybe the French want to have more hegemony in Syria. Maybe the Brits just want to have a chaotic situation in Syria, and maybe the Americans want to have a truncated or dissected kind of Syria. But all of it comes together in one philosophy, that is somehow or some way we are all anti-Assad. Whether he's overthrown or he's weakened or he's emasculated, it doesn't make any difference. We can work together in that way. And that also means arming, training terrorists, which they're doing openly.
Do you see any of the conflict? I mean, I know it already has to some extent, but do you see things spreading to, say, Lebanon?
Yes, it's happening already, yes. The Lebanese government has arrested probably 1,500 terrorists so far. There's been some successes in Tripoli in the northern Lebanon. There have been some executions, beheadings publicly announced. There's a mess in Lebanon right now. There's no president, as you know. They're not able to come to an agreement on who should be president of the country, and the country now is pretty much rudderless. So, yes, it's spread to Lebanon. There's a fear it's going to spread to Jordan, despite the fact that I believe that King Abdullah of Jordan is in fact in cahoots with those who are, committing these acts of terrorism inside Syria. It's happened to Iraq, obviously, guys. I mean, Iraq is in a mess situation right now because of this spreading of the virus. So yes, it's happening.
Hey, Ziad.
Yeah.
If the current Assad's father had been in charge instead of, do you think this would have happened?
A lot of my friends who I trust say no, they would not have happened, because what this actual problem in Syria arose supposedly on March 2011 in Daraa.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you have to know Syria to know that Daraa is not exactly the intellectual capital of Syria. It's a largely it's an agro center. And
Mm-hmm.
while it has produced some luminaries in Syrian society, for example, the deputy foreign minister, Dr. Faisal Maqdad, is from Daraa. The information minister, Omran Zabi, is from Daraa. In general, it's not viewed as a place where you have intense, thinking. This is not the Paris of the 1900s, all right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
But really, what I think happened was 3 months before that, there was a demonstration in Damascus when some of the security forces went into what's called the Souk al-Hamidiyya. This is a big marketplace, very ancient and beautiful, but they went in there and beat the daylights out of some kid who was the son of a major merchant there. Well, there was a demonstration, and what the sitting president at the time, Dr. Assad, did was he sent the interior minister there to talk to them and to calm them down. This is very unusual. You have to understand from the standpoint of Syria's evolution as a modern state, this is very unusual, because General Assad, his father, would have probably sent in the goons, and they would have put an end to the demonstration very quickly. And we wouldn't have heard a peep from them after that. But this time, Dr. Assad goes, no, I'm Western educated. I went to school in London. I'm married to a very British Syrian girl, Asma al-Assad. She's gorgeous, by the way, and very modern, and I want to be viewed that way. And he said, no, let's go talk to them. Well, word got out in Syria that this president doesn't mind a few occasional explosions of anger. And guess what happens in March 2011? They start rioting as part of this Arab Spring thing. Robert Ford, the American ambassador, has in place certain agents provocateurs ready to proceed in shooting Syrians marching to show that it was a Syrian government who was firing at demonstrators, when in fact it was these provocative agents set up by Ford and his minions to make it appear that way. So the answer to you is this: if General Assad was in power, he would have crushed it from the very beginning. Absolutely crushed it. This president chose not to.
Right, but Ziad, the West had been planning this for at least a decade.
Since at least 2007, by the way.
Right. Oh, I'm certain much earlier than that. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, really.
But here's the thing, though. It was even planned when the old Assad was in power. They were always trying to somehow, basically sabotage his government and his efforts. Here, what you had was the interesting confluence of the Arab Spring and this situation having been created by the United States, where you had agents in place and people ready to act on orders to create a situation, a chaotic, anarchic situation. True. But if you had General Assad in power, some of my friends say he would have walked in with such force that the whole plan would have fallen apart, and it would not have continued to spread as it did.
Ziad, some say that this happened because of the liberalization of agriculture. They got rid of subsidies and various other things. So in the agricultural areas, people were suffering economically. Does that sound true?
There is also the problem of the drought. That should also be mentioned in conjunction with what you're talking about. I think the drought of 5 years, where you had people from the area of Deir ez-Zor, and I think now in terms of eastern Syria, far eastern Syria, very rich agricultural area, but suffering from drought and a completely mismanaged, what do you call it, irrigation system. It appears that the irrigation system that was planned and renewed was a failure. And along with the drought, people started moving in the tens of thousands towards the south, towards Daraa. It is true that actually happened, that there were people there who were very aggrieved by the situation, and it may be also the removal of subsidies. It may be true.
Because I think that the Western planners behind all of these wars and, color revolutions and all that, they know that they have to essentially destabilize a country economically. And like this happened in Libya. And if you liberalize in any sense, you create this rich class in the cities, and then you got a lot of unhappy people in the more rural or small towns or whatever. And they're just cannon fodder for stirring up trouble. And if nothing else, you can hire them, to protest or whatever.
Exactly what happened. In fact, most of the rebels, quote-unquote rebels, actually the terrorists, are from the rural areas. The ones who are from the big cities were very pro-Assad and enjoyed the kind of luxuries and all the kinds of aggrandizements that President Assad afforded them. In fact, his power base is really in the cities. It's not in the rural areas. So yes, you're right. And some people say that he should never have ignored the outback. He should never have ignored the farming areas. And when you do that, you do so at your own peril. And I guess it happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully, though, lessons have been learned, and hopefully things will settle down at some point. I
remember Robert Ford being here in the Detroit area in this town called Berkeley. He came at the at the invitation of some of these opposition activists. And I attended by myself. My wife and I went there. And when he was talking, he was saying that, look, don't think that Assad will walk away from this, because he can't expect any support from Russia any longer, because he's got to pay for everything he gets from the Russians. The Russians don't, in the old days would send him jets and missiles and all kinds of goodies, but no more. That under Putin, the Russians will not do that. Well, Ford was wrong, and his failed philosophy, his failed policy is based on the fact that he completely misread the intentions of the Russian Federation. But interestingly, what you're saying is true. The effort to break down the country economically is so crucial to trying to destabilize it. Yes.
Well, I'm just concerned that it may take the collapse of the U.S. dollar or something dramatic between the U.S., Russia and China, because it's kind of like right now we're set aside Syria. You can see it in the Ukraine even more. But, Putin just went to the G20 meeting in Australia. He seemed to have left slightly early. And, the relationship is in a bad way. And, we may be seeing a Cold War or even worse.
Yeah, people have warned about that, yes.
And, that's tragic, but that may be what it takes to get them to back off of Syria.
Well, I mean, I don't think the Chinese want to see the American dollar plummet. They've got
they
so
don't.
much
Well,
money.
I don't even think
that would be a disaster
the Russians
for them. Absolutely, the Russians have an interest in having a stable world economy, so I don't think they're interested in getting into a Cold War, or, into a boxing match with us. At the same time, we keep pushing it. Obama seems to be pushing for some kind of confrontation.
But Ziad, you got to look at it from the other point of view, the point of view of the U.S., the people who control Wall Street or whatever. The rest of the world is rising. If you go to China, Brazil or whatever, a lot of the world, you can see tremendous growth. I mean,
yes.
it's just so in your face. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's when you come back to the U.S. that it looks bad, right? I mean,
True.
There are cities in the U.S., you're near Detroit, right, where,
yes.
You got pipe systems, subways, all kinds of things, sewer systems that are 80 years old, rusting, falling apart. And then you travel around Asia, and it's just modern, prosperous.
Singapore, sure, yeah.
Everyone's optimistic about the future. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, from the point of view of the people who control the U.S. military, every year Asia and, again, other places are developing so quickly. And that saying, the American saying, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yes.
And when all you have is a military, everything looks like a war.
Like a target, yeah.
So I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just saying that even if Russia and China don't want a Cold War, or they don't want something nasty, it's not necessarily their decision. It's up to the people who control the U.S. military.
And Eisenhower's famous warning, warning the American people to beware of the military-industrial complex. You're forgetting the weapons manufacturers here are very powerful lobbies, pushing for war because it improves the economy, it creates jobs in the factories. All that stuff we may get to eventually if the economy here in this country starts to sort of go out of control. Yes.
And whatever you guys do, don't buy gold or silver because that's the currency of ISIS now.
Yeah,
I thought it was Ziad, stolen petroleum.
Ziad, did you see that was it the FBI made that? They admitted they made like a fake. They were arguing that ISIS is going to start a silver and gold currency.
Well, they have a new currency. I saw pictures of it on the internet. Nobody in Syria, any of my sources, ever confirmed to me that they have done this, but they are actually printing a new caliphate, dinar or something. I'm not surprised, and this is typical of the kind of arrogance of people like this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who thinks he's, a caliph means he has to be descended from the messenger of God, Muhammad. So he thinks of himself as that way. And of course, it is totally consistent with his psychosis that he'd want to print money up with his image on it. So yes, I've seen that.
Well, I think the point was.
Laughable.
I think the point Jerry was making is that the people who control the U.S. media now are flagrantly making hoaxes and false flag type things. And they put this story out there because they want to discourage people from buying gold or so. Anyway, they want this image that if you like gold and silver, you're, a crazy, survivalist / white Al Qaeda, whatever. It's all kind of ridiculous. First of all, they're probably busy with their own war, and so I don't know how much gold and silver they're printing in mints or whatever. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Actually very frivolous. To me, being involved in this situation over there in Syria, I view the production or the printing of money or the issue of gold and silver or stolen petroleum or oil as pretty frivolous. I think most Americans agree with me that it's like what is that supposed to do? I'm supposed to go to war over this?
Yeah, exactly.
I can't see it happening.
What do you see with Americans? Do you think Americans are tired of these wars and just say, I don't want to go fight ISIS, I don't care? Or what do you
Paul,
see Americans thinking?
I think you know it as well as I do. Your accent betrays the fact that you are American and you probably deal with Americans all the time. I talk to them in restaurants and in pubs and all over the place. Nobody wants to see the American economy go down because of another war. And the message from Iraq was trillions of dollars lost for nothing. And Afghanistan is 11 years in the making, and we have not gotten any mileage out of the damn war there. And all this talk about the American military being the greatest military in history might be true. But on the ground, we've proven ourselves to be inept politically. And we've sent young servicemen and women to wars that have produced, I would think you'd agree with me on this, produced nothing but defeat. Iraq is arguably the greatest foreign policy disaster in the history of the United States of America. And we were asked to leave with nothing at all in our pockets. So the American people, I think, are more interested right now in who's going to be in the Super Bowl, more so they're interested in seeing an American president get stuck in another cesspool elsewhere in the world.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons Obama has been so hesitant to get involved in the various wars. Is
they're tugging at him. Yeah,
not that he's a hero, but it's like what's in it for really it's a losing deal. It's a no-win deal. Why do we want to get involved in this?
But he's being tugged at. The neocons in Washington, very powerful, backed by a lot of money, and also backed by the Israelis. You got the Christian right, which is a preposterous, almost, just an embarrassing kind of institution that's America, pushing at him also. But you've also got other forces telling him don't do it. For example, you've got some sane, sober-minded people, the Pentagon, saying this is insane to get involved in a third world war with the Russians over Syria or some goddamn gas pipeline. So he's in the middle. He's not an experienced politico. He appears to be lost, somewhat callows in some ways, but he's still holding some ground. He's saying, I'm not going to be a president who has a legacy of getting us stuck into a war. I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to be a George W. Bush. And so far, so good. If he sticks to his guns, he'll leave office with his legacy being Obamacare.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well, yeah, I hope so. Hey, what are your hopes for Syria going forward? I mean, obviously you want the war to
killing
end.
More rats. We're just killing as many rats as we can. We have no other choice. We've been left with no other choice. What we didn't say about Obama was that he still has that doctrine of his. He will continue to support proxies, who will continue to destabilize the country in Syria, and we'll just have to keep strengthening the Syrian military defensive institutions to kill as many as we can. And maybe someday there won't be any more who can come over because there won't be any more alive. I mean, how much more demented do you want to hear? I mean, a person become like myself, because I see no way of resolving this politically. I don't agree with the Russians who think that this can be resolved politically. I think it must be resolved militarily, because they won't stop. And as long as they will not stop, we have no choice but to fight them.
But, by the way, Ziad, the Russians didn't resolve their problem with Wahhabis peacefully. They leveled them, and they basically found that, amnesties and all that didn't even work, because if they're that crazy and suicidal, there's really nothing you can do.
Well, you're talking about Chechnya.
Yeah.
You're probably talking about Chechnya. Well, yes, and they also had some very powerful allies in people like Ramazan Kadyrov, who had their own militias and who also had a vision of what their country should be as it was linked to Russia. In Syria, we've got a constellation of very powerful countries coming together for one purpose, that is to remove the sitting president. And the constellation is made up of NATO, all NATO countries, the United States of America. You've got Saudi Arabia with all its money, Qatar with all its money, and the Emirates with all their money. A massive alliance that I've never seen in a long, long time. And here, fighting a third world country like Syria, it is. I'm so proud to tell you that I am Syrian and that I support the Syrian army. We have been able to actually squelch these horrific barbaric attacks. And guess what? With an ally like Russia, who really won't send troops, or doesn't want boots on the ground there in Syria, and with Iran for the same basic reason. So yes, the Russians crushed the Chechen revolt, and we're trying to crush ours, but ours is made up of a lot more characters and a lot more bad actors.
Oh, sure. I'm just pointing out that if Russia says that, we just want peace or whatever and compromise, they actually didn't compromise in their case. They decided that they had no choice but to just smash it. It's true that they helped Kadyrov and rebuilding Chechnya, so it now looks more modern than Europe. But I'm just saying that when push comes to shove, that they did what they had to do, and so
they did.
That's the way the world works,
And that's what I'm trying to tell you. I wish there was some kind of solution, some panacea for this. I see it basically as no political solution. There's a military solution only.
Yeah. Well, that's about all I can say on that, right? That's all we can say. Ziad, I think we can wrap it up about now. We've gone about 90 minutes. And are there any other last things you would like to say? Mention your blog again. Any other topics?
Well, I certainly would like you to send me by email a link to the interview we just had, because my readers, I got a lot of readers. I'm going to get you even more publicity, and they love to listen in on these things. So I'd love to have that. I really have nothing else to add except that I am very disappointed with the way Western civilization has kind of moved. We all like to think of the European countries as departing, abandoning the old imperialist, colonialist ways, but they have not. And you're seeing it rear its ugly head right now today in Syria. And I hope that the Europeans don't suffer something cataclysmic because of it.
Ziad, we're seeing it in Africa. We're seeing it in the Ukraine. We're seeing it all around the world.
It's horrific. Absolutely horrific.
And they're not even hiding it. They just say, well, you know the story, but they're just bringing the troops in all over Africa now.
Yes.
And you saw what happened
to
Libya.
Reassertion of hegemony and the degradation of the human being. Yeah.
Human spirit. Yeah, so it's kind of depressing. But I think it comes down to that dollar system coming to the end, and so the rise of the rest of the world. So at least that's a good thing. I mean, they're in such a hurry now because they feel like they're running out of time, perhaps.
True.
But anyway, let's call it a wrap. So that'll do it for this time. Thank you, Ziad. We appreciate it. And
Paul, anytime.
Thanks, Ziad.
Okay.
Domo arigato.
There you go. Okay, folks, that's it. It's a wrap. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.